Welcome everyone to our second broadcast live from Dubai here at COP28. Welcome, and we are looking forward to the discussion from PwC's Experience Centre. My name is Jessica Fries and I am the Exec Chair of Accounting for Sustainability, established by His Majesty the King nearly 20 years ago to transform finance and accounting and make sustainable business as usual. I'm really pleased to be joined here in the stage by an excellent set of panellists, and also online we have Hubert joining us. So before we get started, each day at COP has a different thematic focus. So today we're really going to be deep diving into finance and some of the key developments we're seeing from the finance part of the discussion. And really, although yesterday was Finance Day here at COP, we are also seeing a huge amount of discussion on finance throughout the week so far, and I think we will continue to see that into next week. So over the next 45 minutes, we'll be exploring some of the headlines, where we've seen the progress, and what more is needed. Before I turn to the panel, it would be great just to share some of the headlines from His Majesty the King's speech, which opened up the Climate Action Day earlier this week. I shared some of the quotes from the speech, but we have a short clip from the BBC, which we will now play for everyone, just in case you missed his inspiring words.
Lest we rapidly repair and restore nature's unique economy based on harmony and balance, which is our ultimate sustainer, our own economy and survivability will be imperiled. Records are now being broken so often that we are perhaps becoming immune to what they are really telling us. When we see the news that this last Northern Hemisphere summer, for instance, was the warmest global average temperature on record, we need to pause to process what this actually means. We are taking the natural world outside balanced norms and limits and into dangerous, uncharted territory. We are carrying out a vast, frightening experiment of changing every ecological condition all at once, at a pace that far outstrips nature's ability to cope. We are all connected, not only as human beings, but with all living things and all that sustains life. As part of this grand and sacred system, harmony with nature must be maintained. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth.
So His Majesty really helped to set the context for this COP. I think he was sharing some of the insights into the progress that has been made, but really underlining the fact that we need to accelerate the pace of action if we are to have a sustainable future. Hiro, I'm really pleased to be joined by you, Isabella, Mark, and then Hubert online. Hubert, I'll come to you first. So you were former Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on finance, former Chief Investment Officer at the world's largest pension fund in Japan, GPIF, member of A4S's Advisory Council, and also now Special Advisor to MSCI, so one of the very large index organisations. You were also with us in COP26 in Glasgow. So over the last 2 years and over the first few days here at COP, where have you seen the key areas of progress that really give you hope that, as His Majesty said, we are treating the earth in the way that we need to be to have a sustainable future for humanity?
Sure, thank you very much for having me. Yes, I participate in this kind of the program with you in Glasgow, where we had a huge excitement about a lot of commitment made, including the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So, and also to give a huge credit to the UK government as a president of the COP, it was the first time the finance took a center stage. So the world came to realize that without the finance, nothing was going to happen. Well, that can happen, but it's not scalable. So ever since Glasgow, whether it's a finance day or not, the finance really became the main discussion point. So I've been here from the Friday morning, and then it's been every single day. Even I forget which day is a finance day. We've been talking about how finance can accelerate the transition every single day since I arrived. So it's been a lot of progress in terms of awareness, and then also in terms of the industry commitment. Looking back, what we had agreed in Glasgow was we only agreed about our goals. So itself is a dramatic achievement, because the majority of big nations agree, made agreement, agreed to commit to carbon neutrality by 2050, and then also under the Glasgow Financial Alliance, Financial Alliance for Net Zero, 400 financial institutions committed to make their business carbon neutral by 2050. But it's all about kind of committing to the goal, but we really didn't have the real roadmap. And we probably had underestimated the importance of managing transition. So now I think that people became more kind of realize that we really need to manage transition, because we cannot make our economic system or financial system green tomorrow morning. It never happens overnight. So how to transfer, manage the transition finance became the real, the real concern, and also real item for discussion. So realization of that need is the first, kind of a first step. And the second step we took was over the last two COPs, we brought in a lot of input from non-financial institutions, including NGO, about the importance of the fair transition or just transition, because the transition itself is not enough. And this year, every time we discuss about the transition finance, we talk about a just transition, human rights. And from last year, the last COP, we also brought in the biodiversity as a part of this, the painting, our journey on the road to net zero. So it just, I don't really need to talk about all the individual commitments made by the financial institutions, and then you heard a lot. And then on the other hand, finally, we probably be able to deliver, $10 billion finance, which we committed to the developing country, at the time of the Paris Agreement. So on the public and private side, a lot of progress being made, but I think that we are still just started talking about the reality of how to manage transition. And there are so many things we need to figure out, including how to price the carbon properly. And we have been discussing about a voluntary carbon credit market, but it's just the beginning, and we really need to speed up to achieve.
And picking up some of the themes that you've been discussing there, one of the big areas of discussion that we've seen is indeed on the whole question of carbon pricing, and how do you really value carbon, both as part of protecting nature as well has been the discussion, but also making sure that we can scale up some of the investments that are needed. Mark, if I can come to you. So Mark Versey, CEO of Aviva Investors. A4S has been working with Aviva in the build-up to the COP summit as part of A4S's own summit, and shared a set of recommendations. But I know that Aviva, as with Hiro, has been involved in some of the COP process for quite a long time. So from your perspective as an investor, what are you seeing as the key developments and some of the key areas of discussion relevant to finance from here in COP?
Well, thanks for including me. I think what I'm seeing this year is sort of the tone is all about mobilizing the finance. And that's shifted the last couple of years. I think, as Hiro said, it was about sort of the awakening that we need the finance. And the tone this year has been, how do we get the finance actually moving? And at the A4S summit, we also spoke about accelerating the transition. We talked about collaboration. That's between the policymakers and regulators, with finance and with business. So we have to all work together in order to actually mobilize this money. We spoke about transition plans, the need for those, and how that's going to be really important going forward for allocating money. And we spoke about transforming the financial architecture, which is about how do we actually accelerate the money, particularly getting the investment money into the emerging market economies. And all three of those I'm seeing in abundance in the Finance Day yesterday. So, I mean, collaboration is everywhere. I mean, as Hiro said, finance is in every room, which is a big change from where we used to be. And I think the private sector is actually getting this. They want to invest. There's some really good opportunities for investment. This is big business. But I think the focus has been the multilateral development banks for me. They're the people who have stepped up and announced that climate nature is part of their mandate. It is part of financial stability. And so they now want to accelerate what they do, expand their balance sheets, get the money moving. So if that can happen, that's going to enable companies like us, Aviva, to invest into the emerging economies, which is really difficult for an insurer to invest in. The credit risk is higher, there are currency risks. But if you can do it in conjunction with the MDBs, actually I think that will help. So we need to see action, but that's probably the most exciting thing that I've seen.
Yeah, and so I think that's a really good point to be bringing both Hubert in from online and Isabel coming to you as well here in the studio. So in terms of the MDB reform, certainly one of the key things that we've seen happening, and this was launched earlier in the year, was a private sector lab which the new president of the World Bank has established. Now he comes from a private sector background, and I think you're seeing that real focus on where the World Bank and other multilateral development banks can really focus on that question of de-risking, so that the discussion, as you were saying, Hiro, from billions to trillions, which has been talked about for a long time, the kind of trillions that are needed, how some of that de-risking can happen so that the private sector capital that is needed really can flow. Isabella, if I can come to you next. So you are the founding partner and co-CEO of ImpactA Global. You have a banking background, and you have also really focused on the emerging and developing market for a long time, and particularly infrastructure. So can you say a little bit more about that point that Mark was just touching on of are you seeing barriers in terms of private capital really flowing to the infrastructure where it's needed? And of course, much of the infrastructure is indeed needed in emerging and developing economies. So what are you seeing actually on the ground?
Yes, hi Jessica. I think I will agree with everything that was said here. We had, even if we set aside the challenges related to climate change, the infrastructure gap in emerging markets is over $1 trillion a year, right? If you add in the challenges related to climate, then you can talk about 3, 4, 5 trillion. And the MDBs, the DFIs cannot do it alone. They don't have enough capital. So we need to be smarter about the way in which we deploy their capital so that we can engage more private capital. So at ImpactA Global, we are focused on actually bringing private capital to finance sustainable infrastructure in the Global South. We think that actually infrastructure debt is a very resilient asset class that caters well for private investment, but there's always the perception of risk around emerging markets that is a barrier at the outset before further analysis. I agree that there has to be, to some degree, a regulatory reform to enable more of this of these investments, and we need to bring a better match between how we use official money as to enable, leverage the most the ability of private capital to come to developing economies. I think this has been a theme for a long time. It's becoming more and more pressing. And perhaps what I've seen here at COP is we do see private capital here, the discussion about finance. Everybody understands that it needs to get done. So I think we're finally getting to a point that where okay, it needs to get done. How do we build the infrastructure of the financial systems as to enable this? And this is really what we're focused on, bringing more private capital to fund this infrastructure gap.
Yeah, and so just two follow-up questions, or one follow-up question in terms of the a key barrier that is discussed quite a lot is project pipeline.
Yeah.
So saying, you know, from the capital side of the equation, that it's very hard to find the projects that are ready for investment.
Yeah.
On the ground, and so quite a lot of discussion of one of the potential solutions of different ways of getting projects investment ready, looking at different ways to parcel up sets of projects so that the scale of the finance can better match the type of investment vehicles. Can you say a bit more about what you're seeing? Is there a challenge in that area?
Absolutely. There is partially a challenge in sort of creating the right pipeline, but there's enough pipeline out there that is not getting financed, that is bankable, and is not getting done. I think in order to increase pipeline, this is a sort of all hands on deck kind of exercise. I think developing economies need to do their work, because even if we talk of 1, 2, 3, 4 trillion, they cannot necessarily, the emerging economies cannot necessarily absorb all of that debt on their balance sheet. Right, so we need to create more sort of PPP frameworks, or more private versions of investments in order to achieve these the development goals and the building infrastructure. So absolutely, there's a part of the job that needs to get done and made by countries, and in that respect, institutions such as the World Bank help a lot in creating this the framework in countries. Different countries work at different speeds. We have a lot of philanthropic capital, a lot of financing and technical assistance that go directly to getting projects ready for financing. Perhaps you can see a little bit more of that. But I think that before there's already enough of a pipeline that can be financed now that is not getting done because the right kind of capital is not available.
Yeah. Hubert, if I can now bring you in online, if we're able to get Hubert online. So you do a lot of work in this area as well. So Hubert, you're CEO and Chairman of Africa Investment Group, also a member of A4S's Advisory Council. And I know that you've been really focused on how to scale up and mobilize private finance, both into Africa, but also more broadly thinking about how to really scale up finance into your developing and emerging economy. So can you say a little bit more about both that question of some of the developments you've seen in the discussion around the role that multilateral development banks can play, but also more broadly where you see the key steps forward in terms of mobilising private finance?
No, thank you very much, Jessica. And I think I agree with all of my colleagues where, you know, it's probably appropriate to just say we talked about finance on Finance Day. It's absolutely been a theme throughout, from the Loss and Damage Fund to the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund to this Altera $30 billion platform. But here's where I sort of come in on this. We are talking, I personally believe that the whole agenda has been mischaracterized as a finance agenda to just interests of the development finance institutions, current and legacy business models. Because when you begin to look at the trillions that are required and the sort of the multi-decade approach that we have, this is really a long-term investment. And, you know, whilst I welcome all different sort of multilateral development bank I don't know, increased demonstrations of intent in the future to mobilize private capital at scale. The reality is they don't have the balance sheets to be able to mobilize trillions that we need, and they don't have the internal systems or the culture to be able to do it at the speed that we need. So I think everything and everyone sort of got on the bandwagon saying, yes, everything must be catalyzed through the MDBs, but we're in a private capital mobilization market failure. MDBs are supposed to mobilize $10 for every $1 of finance that they provide. And their ratio, according to the G20, is they mobilize 20 cents to 38 cents for every dollar. I remember being in Glasgow talking about 8 or so years for Africa to mobilize $3 trillion for our nationally determined projects. I'm here now talking about much less than that to mobilize even more. So I think that going through the MDBs and making them the principal de-risker and mobilizer for these trillions is a lost opportunity. I think we need to create a whole new reality and a very different model. If you want to mobilize public capital at scale, it's probably not best to come to the private sector and ask for advice about how to do that. Conversely, if you want to mobilize private capital at scale, I believe if you can actually work with the institutional investment community, the 150 to the 200 trillion pool of assets who are universal owners, long-term investors, I think you're going to get a very different and more strategic outcome. But the problem is that we have our heads of state, and I served on President Macron's new financial pact, private sector and finance task force preparing for the new financial pact summit. And there just doesn't seem to be a realism about how to do things at scale. We sort of default back to the old models, and they're just not going to work. And if you look at the fundamental things that we need, just like data, the multilateral development banks hold the Global Emerging Markets Database, which is critical. I mean, it has all of the performance of their loans over the last 20 years. As the institutional investment community, we've been asking for this for over 10 years. They've refused to give us this database so that we can actually increase our exposure and properly price our exposure to emerging markets and developing countries. And that consequently costs emerging markets and developing country governments $15.6 billion each year in excess interest on their loans, and it's not happening. So I'm not a great believer that and the reality is, Jessica and viewers, even if all of the reforms happen, even if the private sector lab works, it will never be able to mobilize more than 10% of the financing gap. So, what we really need to say amongst ourselves, the Avivas, the Africa investors, the global institutional market, came together as a group and we issued a statement as institutional investment community at the beginning of this COP. It was ourselves, it was Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, it was Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, ILN, SMI, calling for what we're describing as an institutional investor partnership with heads of state. Because we believe that we need to be able to re-architect the entire system so that it can actually be conducive for private capital mobilization, because we don't believe a public sector mindset with a slightly different philosophy that's got us into this private capital mobilization market failure is capable of getting us out of it at speed. So let me stop there, Jessica. Those are just some of the views. And for pipeline piece, it's just another example. The project pipelines in emerging markets and developing countries are typically funded by technical assistance from multilateral development banks that design projects for development finance, not for long-term equity and institutional capital. That's where we have a fundamental mismatch of strategy, approach, and alignment with investment policy statements. And I think until we get there, we're just going to have maybe development capital at scale and not private capital mobilization at speed and scale. Let me stop there.
Yeah, so let me pose that question then to everyone back here in the studio. So Hiro, can I come to you first? So where how much do you agree with some of the points that Hubert was saying there, and where do you think that the private sector could be doing more to really mobilize and close that gap that Hubert was talking about?
I really cannot agree more. that I always think like that we really haven't really solved the real blockage of the private capital, private financial market to flow their capital into the developing needs in particularly global south. So I just want to say something like, if we look back at the history of our industry, there's only two ways we ever scaled up any asset class. One is by creating agency model. It's like something like private equity. So the big asset owner, like a pension fund, don't need to look into individual project or individual investment opportunity. Somebody gathers the asset, so they can really trust their big chunk of the check with those aggregators. So that's one way, in our industry ever built the big asset class. And then the other way we have managed to do that is by standardization, like a green bond. So I always say, like in the history of our industry, there's only two ways we really scaled up the new asset class. So what's missing in our talk about the how to mobilize the MDBs, or how to increase more the blended finance, innovative finance, because I was a special envoy of the UN trying to promote the innovative the finance scheme working with the MDBs, but there's no agency model, and then there's no standardization. So we are basically just hoping MDB team up with somebody to work on the case-by-case the approach, which is not going to scale up. So that's one thing I just wanted to say. Like the MDB at least trying to standardize some approach or some documentation, so that the investor or like a private sector partner doesn't have to evaluate every single investment from scratch. The other thing I just want to point out is like to really mobilize public financial system, which is like the fixed income and public equity. There's the two major determining factor where the capital is flowing. One is a benchmarking practice, and the other is credit rating practice. Mark mentioned about the insurance company cannot invest a lot in non-investment graded the issuers, and then it's not only insurance companies, and the big pension fund usually have less than 10% allocation to non-investment grade, and then all those developing countries by definition not investment graded the issuers. So without the approaching the industry practice of using benchmark to the allocate the capital, and the either revisiting how the credit rating is evaluate the credit, or we challenge ourselves the way we use credit rating. Without doing those two, we are basically scratching the surface. The core of the capital market is not shifting at all. Yeah. So that's actually the reason behind I joined the MSCI, trying to change the benchmarking practice.
Yeah, and I mean, so much capital flows through benchmarks. Unless that can be shifted, then those trillions really won't flow. Mark?
Well, I think what we heard was a call for the agency model. That's to mobilize the private capital. Which I think is great, but I think that's really hard. So I think we must do that, and we've seen a launch of a 30 billion fund, which I guess is sort of trying to do some of that at the COP. For me, the MDB approach is the standardizing approach. So if we can get the ratio 1 to 10, then you are mobilizing a lot of private capital, and we said it's 1 to 0.2 at the moment. So to get from 1 to 10 ratio that's the magic bullet for me. In the beginning, it won't solve the problem, but it will mobilize the private capital from the pension funds and the insurance companies around the world, because then you can get a standard bond. So if we could create a standard bond approach that all these MDBs could launch, get the credit rating to make sure we're investing in investment grade quality. It can be long term. I think there will be quite a lot of demand for that. But turning all the talk we're hearing into action is frustratingly slow, and so it does need the private sector to really get involved, collaborate, and move at pace.
Isabella, did you want to add on anything on this particular point?
Yeah, I would perhaps sort of go back a little bit to the initial point I made, which is we need to use to better use the capital that the MDBs and DFIs have available for finance. We see often that the DFIs will take the most senior piece of a financing, sort of crowding out some capital, private capital that could actually be taking that place. So being smarter about the way the MDB, so we talked about technical assistance, getting projects ready. So the MDBs and the DFIs focusing sometimes a little bit more on first losses that then can enhance the rating of the senior tranches so that then institutional capital can come. Looking at taking out the political risk. You know, we know that there are political risk insurance products on the market, not only from the official sector, such as MIGA, but also from the private sector. So the insurance industry actually is one of the types of investors that bear most of this emerging markets risk and successfully. It's a very good business for insurers that play in that space. So that 10-to-1 will not, that 10-to-1 ratio will not happen with the DFIs to taking the most senior piece of capital in financing. So we need to make better use of these instruments so that we bring in private capital at scale into a resilient asset class that already today is resilient, but that can have even better ratings, and that will provide very good risk-return ratios. Yeah. It's essential that we change the way the MDB capital is being used.
Right. Yeah, and I think that touches on two additional themes, and that I've certainly heard a lot of discussion on. One is the level of trust between the private and public sector in different ways to really improve that trust, because you have sometimes very different approaches, different cultures, and actually that's one of the things that needs to change. And the other is perception risk, that often, as you were saying there, the returns can be very, very good, but the perception is not necessarily there. So finding ways to overcome that. Now we've got just over 10 minutes left, so I'd like to move on and just touch on one of the other really key themes, and get each of your perspectives from the finance side of the equation. So one of the new classes that there's been a lot of discussion around is around transition finance, and really putting in place the right kind of standards that are going to enable money to flow to that whole transition finance space. There are some developments in terms of creating the right definitions, but I think a huge amount of debate still in that area. One of the key areas that people see as essential to underpin more transition finance is transition plans, and definitely calls for transition plans, not just amongst companies, but also for financial institutions, for governments, for all actors within the economy. So if I could just get comments from everyone in terms of how you see transition plans playing a key part of the solution, a key part of the mix in terms of enabling some of the capital to flow. Mark, can I come to you first?
Sure. So Aviva is working on its second iteration of a transition plan, one of the first companies to launch one. I think what's really good about a transition plan is, instead of just the commitment to be net zero 2050, 2040, it actually says how you're going to get there. It has milestones, so the 5-year and the 10-year ones, and then it actually goes into detail about what you're going to do to hit those milestones. And then it has a layer of governance and accountability as well, so you have to have your executive pay, for example, aligned to hitting those milestones. So it's actually quite a big piece of work to do one of these, but it becomes a strategy document for your business. Now, what's great about once you disclose it is investors can use this to actually see what the transition of a company is going to look like. And that's going to be critical in the future for investment capital to flow, and for insurance to actually decide whether they're going to insure projects and companies. So I think instead of a backward-looking accounting measure, this is a forward-looking projection. And that aligns with investment strategies, because investment decisions are about forward-looking. So transition plans is going to be vital for all businesses to do, and I completely agree. Ultimately, we need government-level transition plans, sector by sector, so we can actually see the pathway for each sector across the whole economy.
Yeah. Hiro,
Yeah.
how about you? How do you see transition plans both emerging in the discussions here and more broadly, and also being key to adoption of and scaling up the capital?
Yeah, well, this year we are talking about global stocktake, but I think the transition plan is one way of each entity or each participant to this systemic transformation of the economy have to do themselves. And then we need to check, that each player's transition plan is consistent with the others. And that's the only way for us to achieve our ultimate goal. But one thing I've been a bit concerned about the transition finance is, when we started, like I started advocating for the green investment, I have been questioned about the greenwashing so often. And each time I try to say, well, it's still better than no washed. But the greenwashing has been used as the way to kind of push back green investment. But I was really less concerned about a greenwashing on a real green project. But transition washing is actually real risk. Because a lot of a transition finance and a transition plan is that when I look at that into the details, it seems like they are actually not accelerating transition, but they are slowing down the transition. So every transition plan and also the transition finance to finance it, we just really need to check, if this transition finance is actually accelerating transition or not.
Yeah.
And without that question, there will be a lot of transition washing, which is actually even more concerning to me. So the checking the plan and the finance to make sure we are achieving acceleration is a key.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, and I think that whole point around, what makes some of the transition finance credible, because there are some really good examples of how that is, for example, accelerating coal coming offline as one example of how transition finance can be used effectively. Now, for that period, financed emissions might be going up.
Yeah.
But that could look exactly the same, and you have to have a number of years for that to happen. Could be the same as your example of an organisation where the transition is being slowed down rather than speeded up, and sometimes it can be quite hard to distinguish the two. So some very clear guardrails, and the role of some of the profession, accounting profession, to really help to provide some of that credibility, I think could be quite important. Now we're nearly out of time, so I'm going to come to each of you. Isabella, I'll be coming to you first, to just say what you're going to be looking out for during the rest of COP28, but then also thinking ahead what you think COP will be helping to mobilise and accelerate into next year and then beyond. So Isabella.
Thank you. I'm very happy with the announcements that we've had so far. The 30 billion is quite impressive. There are quite a few separate commitments. We need to see how that pans out and gets rolled out. What I fear a little bit is what we've had, talking a little bit about transition plans, but also regulatory frameworks and what is greenwashing and what isn't. When we look at SFTR, NTCFD, etc., there's a degree of complexity in the regulation sometimes about what is a green investment, what is impact investment, Article 8, Article 9, all very technical, and we need to be careful about not having sort of the tail wagging the dog. People get so caught up in, is this going to meet my regulatory requirement, yes or no, when we perhaps sometimes lose sight of the greater objective, which is to create the impact, to create that green infrastructure. And sometimes people get bogged down into whether this fits here or there, and we need to move away from here. So my hope is that now we have real mobilization and focus, and I feel that here, so that we go beyond the technicalities of regulation and say we're really going to deliver this. And what are the bottlenecks that we need to address?
Mark, same question to you.
I think I'd like to see something about converting the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, into transition plans, so that you really do have each country making its own plan and sector by sector. I think if we can see how each country is going to mobilize in each sector, which is policy decisions, its subsidies, its tax incentives, etc., then that will unblock a lot of the private capital to come. I mean, it's a big piece of work, obviously, for each country, but that call for a transition plan at country level is ultimately what we're going to need.
And I think that talks quite a lot to what you will be seeing in the build-up to COP30, which will be hosted in Brazil. Governments will be being asked to recommit around their nationally determined contributions, so what they're going to be doing to reduce emissions. There's a lot of discussion around cities and sub-national actors being part of those commitments, and I think also quite interesting discussions on national transition plans as being a key vehicle that needs to be developed. Hiro.
Well, I think all the countries who committed net zero, I wanted to question them, how many of those actually had their financial regulator to change their regulation to lead their financial institution on the trajectory? Probably none.
Yeah.
So I think there should be a consistency in the policy making, not just making their gesture, but those people have to work hard on to put that in a real policy. But from the private, the investors' perspective, as a CIO of GPAO, I kind of sat on the top of financial ecosystem for 5 years, and then my observation has been, financial system is like a big machine, always hungry for data to process. And then I think we really need to, standardize data and bring in a lot of data, because I believe the financial system, as soon as they have data set to analyze, they start processing it. It didn't happen yet, but it happens. I think there will going to be big change in the valuation of all the assets we're holding and that we are holding as the financial industry, and that's waiting to happen. So this year, a lot of discussion about the standardization of the disclosure and the data set to make available for everybody. Well, I think that's probably been the key, real, game changer to shift the whole financial system, and the regulator should put their hands on that too.
Yeah. Yeah, and absolutely around the whole data. We've at A4S we've obviously touched on this a lot in our discussions and the work that we've done over the last few decades, and I think you really are seeing that as part of the system with the ISSB's creation, with the endorsement from the security regulatory community, and of course big developments like the EU mandating their sustainability disclosure requirements. Hubert, if I can come to you for the same question. So what are you looking for from the rest of COP and then into next year?
I think I 27 asking for some realism on really integrating the investor community into the COP process at the UNFCCC level, but I really wanted to see COP 28 really take that leadership. I think we're getting there, but we're still finance. I want us to be investment as well. I want us to be really investment focused. I want the incentives and a new partnership between what we're calling climate investment statesmanship, a new partnership between the 150 to the 200 trillion pool of long-term institutional assets, and they come together in an institutional investor-public partnership. I mean, in Africa now, super natural capital abundance, 60% of the world's renewable energy, assets, if you like, 40% of the key critical minerals that will drive the key green technologies going forward, and all of our advantages. We want to start hearing the climate agenda described as an incentive, as an investment opportunity. And then really being able to align capital. So we're describing it on the African continent as, how do we, as Hiro was saying, and as Mark was saying, and Isabel was saying, that, how do we describe it as an asset class? So we're talking about it in terms of how can you get either developing country or African green industrial infrastructure as a globally competitive, investable asset class. So our phrase for this, and what we really want to see as it relates to private capital mobilization at scale, not the whole agenda, but if you're looking to mobilize private capital at scale, we feel that the market should stop trying to make investment developmental. We actually believe that development should be made investable. And that way we appeal to the whole of the market on the private capital mobilization agenda. So that's really what we're looking for. Private capital mobilization, appeal to how to make it work.
Fantastic, and I think that that is a great phrase to be finishing on. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers here in the studio and Hubert to you online. Thank you for everyone for watching. This is our last live from COP28 broadcast from here in Dubai. Over the rest of the week ahead, we're going to be running a number of workshops and roundtables, looking at how we can continue the dialogue, but also build capacity. I think capacity building and enabling all of us to take the kind of decisions that we need to take to achieve the progress that we need to see is going to be critical. As the UN emissions gap report highlighted, we have only a 14% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, even in the most optimistic scenarios. We need to stay optimistic to contain and to continue to have that chance, but it really highlights that we need to increase the amount of progress that we're making and do so fast if we're going to have a resilient world. So I am grateful to all of our panelists for sharing some of their insights into how we get the investment to flow to be able to build that resilience, tackle nature loss and halt climate change. So thank you again for listening, and we will be back soon as part of future A4S broadcasts.